Hello and welcome again. Let me ask you a question. Is property still a good investment? Now, the reason I ask this is because there is all sorts of legislation that's gone through in the last few years that has made it more difficult for private landlords in the UK. First, we had in 2015 the ex-Chancellor George Osbourne, who now has about 6 jobs, including the editor of the Evening Standard. He brought in legislation which is effectively ending tax relief that you get on the interest you pay on the mortgage to buy a property. Now, this is unprecedented because normally in a business, if you borrow money to buy a business, you would get tax relief on the interest that you pay to purchase that business or asset. But he's taken this away from private landlords, although this doesn't apply to larger landlords who have their companies, properties in limited companies. He also removed the wear and tear allowance, which gave a further relief for replacing furniture and fittings and that sort of thing. So it was a kind of a double whammy. Now, this legislation came into effect a couple of years ago, and I think at the moment, from April 2017, at the moment there's only 25% relief available on the interest payment, and from next year it will be phased out altogether. So in other words, if in the past you had a mortgage and the mortgage was costing you £10,000 a year and your rent was £10,000 a year, they would deduct the interest from that and you wouldn't pay any tax. Now, you might have other bits to go on that, but that was effectively it. Now you would pay tax on the rental turnover. So that's going to hit a lot of landlords who are not prepared for that fairly hard. And it would already be hitting them now, but next year they're going to really feel it. And then last week we heard that the government is bringing in legislation to end what they call no-fault evictions, or currently known as a Section 21, where you can issue the Section 21 to a tenant to say, look, your tenancy's ended, we would like you to leave. I'm not sure why they call it an eviction, but for some reason it's called that. So I'll come on to that in a second, but there are two major things going on, and then there's this sort of general call for long-term, open-ended tenancies, which the government perhaps will introduce. We don't know yet. So a lot of landlords might feel that's quite restrictive. They don't want to have a tenant in there forever, and they don't want to have to come up with a lot of reasons to ask them to leave. I think eviction's the wrong word, because at the end of a tenancy, it's the end of the agreement, isn't it? Why should it take an eviction to ask somebody to leave? They should just leave. So there's a few things going on here, and generally the tide seems to be turning against landlords in general. We're not held in very high esteem. We're seen as greedy landlords, and on the BBC they've mentioned things like hits young people the hardest, landlords, unscrupulous landlords, and people don't have any peace of mind. And it says here that the Citizens Advice Bureau says that tenants who made a formal complaint had a 46% chance of being evicted. This is where they've cited examples on the news where they've had people saying, oh, we just complained about this and that, and the landlord came in and said, we want to end your tenancy on 2 months' notice. And I don't agree with that. I don't know why a landlord would do that, because if a house has a leak, as this example, they had a leak in the roof, why wouldn't the landlord not want to repair it? So I don't know whether there's more to those stories than meets the eye. I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't have thought any landlord I know would evict a tenant just because they complain about a few repairs that need doing. You go in and do the repairs. It costs you money to evict a tenant because you've got to get a new tenant. The property could be empty for a while. I mean, I had if a property's empty for say a month, that's quite a lot of money just to lose by having to ask someone to leave and get another one in and pay a letting agent perhaps to get that new tenant in. So I don't know whether those stories are true or not. I don't know, but there was a similar one on Sky News as well. So the government are saying, under new plans, landlords would have to provide a concrete, evidenced reason already specified in law in order to bring tenancies to an end. Now, personally, I think that's nonsense, because surely if you sign up for an agreement, whether it's a contract to do a job or a lease on a shop, you have that for a certain time, and at the end of it, you know that that's come to an end. Now, what they want is for tenancies to just run on forever. Now, on one hand, that might be good for landlords because they might say, well, I don't mind if a tenant wants to stay for 5, 10 years. I went to see a property recently, and the tenant in there at that time had been there 10 years. The landlord had not put up the rent in that 10 years. However, the place was, I have to say, was in a bit of a state because the landlord hadn't done any work. But, and they give an example here of somebody who they try and balance it by giving an example of an owner of a property called Michael Downs, rents out a masonette in Warwickshire, said that after an experience with a tenant, he feels that everything is stacked up against the landlord, whereas the head of Shelter, the charity, the homelessness charity, said everything's stacked up in favour of the landlord. So there's two different viewpoints there. However, at the moment, you can still use what's called a Section 8 for possession where somebody has broken the terms of their agreement, they haven't paid their rent. But that requires going to court. Now, I'll give you an example. I had a tenant recently in a HMO, house and multiple occupation. She was causing a bit of trouble because her boyfriend was turning up at the property and basically harassing some of the other female tenants in the property, and they were scared of him. And he was kind of acting in a menacing way. So I said we gave her a warning, then we said, look, we'd like you to leave. Her tenancy was coming to an end anyway. But she's dug her heels in, and she's still there. All right, her boyfriend doesn't turn up anymore, but she just said, I can't go. And the letting agents then decided, well, it wasn't worth trying to fight it. We might as well just see it out. And she was paying her rent anyway. So I've taken a view that, well, let's see what happens. Let's leave her there. I don't want to put anybody on the streets, but if they're causing trouble in the house and other people have been upset, then you've got to do something. So it's not as easy as these charities make out. In another case, a friend of mine had a tenant where she just wanted to empty the property. Everyone had left, and this one tenant who was left, and her tenancy had come to an end, just said, well, I can't go, and I'm not going. And you'll have to issue a Section 21. She knew her rights, as it were, then called the council. The council caused all sorts of problems, and it made life very difficult when all it was that her tenancy had come to an end, and you would normally expect someone to leave at that point, but she dug her heels in. Now, if you're a tenant now and you've got a bad landlord, you might be saying, well, this is all wrong and it's a good thing that the government are doing this. But personally, I think that if you've got rogue landlords and unscrupulous landlords who really are bad landlords, then bring in legislations to deal with them rather than hitting everybody else over the head with a big stick, because there are a lot of good landlords that will decide that they've just had enough. And this brings me on to a kind of an opportunity, really, because a lot of people in the property world are saying that this is actually a good time to buy because so many landlords are getting out of the market. And that may be true, but you need to take your own advice on that. But I'm certain that there are some landlords who've cut down on the size of their portfolio, perhaps where they've had 4 or 5 properties that were all on high mortgages, because they took the view that they would grow over time. And I've used that strategy myself in the past. But then you might say, well, hang on a second, if I'm not going to get the tax relief on the mortgage, it's going to cost me more. Why don't we sell a couple and pay off mortgages so that you're left with lower levels of property, but with either no mortgage or very small mortgages, so that the relief element doesn't really matter. So a lot of landlords have done that, and the market has gone down in the last couple of years. The prices have gone down, so definitely things have slowed up. In addition, it's become more difficult to borrow money because they've tightened up the rules on buy-to-let mortgages. So all in all, it doesn't look good. And you may take a view that that's the time to buy, or you may take the view that maybe it's time to sit it out and see what happens. I still think in the long run, property is a good investment. And if you want to get the tax relief on the mortgage, then you'd have to use a limited company in which to buy the property. There are other ways, but the main way would just be set up a limited company and buy the property in that limited company's name. However, there's a couple of drawbacks there. Not many lenders are, surprisingly enough, I don't know what's wrong with them, that they're not all lending to limited companies. I've got no idea why, because lending to a limited company is no more riskier than lending to an individual, because the individual is still signing a personal guarantee, if you like, that if that mortgage defaults, they're still liable. So the lender has still got absolute security over the property, and they've got everybody well and truly tight in the vice there. So there's no danger of the lender losing out any more money than they would if they were lending to an individual. The fact that it's in a limited company would normally mean that the person is a bit more responsible. They're taking more time and trouble to set things up properly. However, the mortgages, because there's fewer lenders doing these, and most of them are challenger lenders, these new challenger banks, the mortgages are more expensive. And I looked into this recently and found that if I was buying in my own name, I could have a mortgage at say 2%. But in the limited company's name, it was working out at 3.5% and sometimes even 4%. So therefore, even with the tax relief, I'd still be worse off in net terms buying through a limited company than I would just buying in my own name and forgetting about the tax relief. In the end, on that deal, I didn't go ahead with it because life just became a little bit too difficult. So I'm personally sitting things out at the moment. I'm waiting to see what happens with the market. Same with the stock market. There's been a bull run in the stock market for 10 years now, and even wise old investors like Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, who run the Berkshire Hathaway fund. I think they've got 172 billion in that fund, and they own 60 or 70 companies. So I think they do know a thing or two about investing. They said that there's nothing out there that's worth buying because the prices are too high. And I think Charlie Munger, his partner, has not bought anything for a year. They just constantly sit down and look at company reports. They study these companies, looking for good companies to buy, but they're waiting for those companies to be on sale, if you like, when the market inevitably takes a downward turn. Now, when that will happen, nobody knows. They don't know, and no one's making that prediction. But certainly, it can't go on forever. And if it can't go on in the stock market, then it can't go on forever in the property market. You can't just have a bull run in a property market forever. Now, prices have dipped in the property market, so a lot of people believe that that's going to be it. It won't fall any further. And with Brexit, there was definitely a slowdown in the market, but that reluctance of people to buy seems to have come to an end. And agents now reporting that more sales are going through as people say, well, I don't care what happens with Brexit, I need to buy a house, and I can't wait for the next 5 years until we actually leave the European Union. When that will be is another story as well. So a lot of people are just going ahead and buying. And the other thing to remember is that there will always be a demand for property, either to buy or to rent, because the population is increasing, people are living longer, there's more divorces. That's another thing. The government are introducing laws to make it easier to divorce. And when people divorce, what do they need? They need smaller units, they need to rent for a time. So in the long run, I think property is still a good investment. And I've gone through this in other episodes, but basically you can borrow to buy property. It's generally safe and secure. You get a good rate of return on your money as opposed to being in the bank. If you get a 5% yield on a property, that's like 20, maybe 50 times more than you'll be getting in a bank account. So it's still a good investment, in my opinion, in the long run. And so don't worry about these things. With these announcements, the devil is always in the detail. The government has a habit of making these bold announcements and bold announcements on new policies, but then when it comes down to the nitty-gritty, they have to think it through, and we don't know what will happen in the end or when it will come through. But obviously, if they go too far, and it goes back to the old secured tenancies years and years ago, where after the terrible time that tenants had in the 50s and 60s, they brought in secure tenancies where basically you couldn't get rid of a tenancy for life, and you couldn't put the rent up. It was controlled rent. It was very difficult to put the rent up. So we don't want to go back to those days, because obviously at that time landlords stopped renting out property, and it just said, well, this is not a viable investment. So we don't want to go down to that stage, do we? We don't want to get back to a stage where somebody moves into your property and it takes heaven and earth to move them out, whatever they're doing. And I personally think whilst it's nice to have a tenant who stays for a long time, sometimes you just want to change. You might want to just sell, or you just find that you want to move everybody out and redo the property. So we'll have to see what comes out of these new rules, and as it will all be in the detail. So let's keep an eye on things as we go along. But I wouldn't be certainly panicked into selling at the moment. Let's see how things pan out. So that's all for now. Good luck with your investing, and it's always better to invest in assets than it is to buy consumer goods, because assets put money into your pocket and consumer goods are liabilities which take money out of your pocket. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.